Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight. This week, we dedicated our In Focus conversations to various elements of growth in Utah. We've talked about agriculture, transportation, air quality, and water. Tonight, the final installment of our series is about housing. Kicking off our conversation tonight is Ari Bruning, President and CEO of Envision Utah. And Ari, welcome back. Thank you for being here again.
Thanks for having me again.
Ari, we are in one of the craziest housing markets with prices raging out of control. Tell us what is behind this craziness.
Well, we're kind of seeing a perfect storm where we have a lot of growth, people aren't moving out, and at the same time we have our millennial generation, which in Utah is enormous, getting of that age where they're looking for housing. And then at the same time we have supply constraints that are reducing how much housing we're building, whether it's labor shortages or the pandemic causing impacts on being able to get materials at affordable prices and so forth. So a lot of things are happening, but the bottom line is just that we don't have enough housing. We have a shortage, and when you have a shortage, prices go up. And we need more housing of all kinds, apartments, condos, townhomes, duplexes, single-family homes, especially on small lots.
It is a really tough time to buy right now. Can you talk about the geographical constraints that we have here in the state? Why can't we grow out like cities such as Atlanta or Dallas?
Yeah, places like Dallas are able to just add another ring of suburbs, and so they can keep up with their housing needs and keep the housing prices relatively affordable. We can't do that. We have mountains and lakes, and growing out farther means jumping into the next valley over and adding a bunch of time to everybody's commutes.
Now, I'm wondering what you think about this notion that everyone says, oh, we keep growing because everyone from California keeps moving here. How true is that? Why can't we stop growing in population?
Well, people moving in from outside the state are a good chunk of our growth, but 2/3 of our growth over time has been our own kids. And it's not as simple as just saying, let's stop growing. I hear people sometimes talk as if just going to their city council meeting and asking the city council to not approve housing is a way to stop growth. Well, if you don't approve housing, the people don't go away. You just deny them a place to live. And the people you're pricing out probably don't include somebody from California who's selling $1 million home and moving to Utah. People you're pricing out are probably our own kids. Now, and that's kind of the mistake that California itself made over the last several decades. They had rampant growth, and they kind of decided to make it really difficult to build housing. And we've seen the results of that in California. It's not good. You have $1 million homes and so forth, really difficult to get a house there. And because they didn't plan for the growth, it's kind of happened in a little bit more of a haphazard way, and traffic is terrible.
And Ari, we've been talking a lot about the future and our kids. Do you think that our kids are going to have to move a long way to find a place that they can afford? What can we do to get these prices under control?
Well, we're all going to have to be part of the solution here, as with most of our challenges that we have. Sometimes people will say, I agree we need more housing, just not here. And they have good reasons for it. And then the next community over says, just not here. And they have good reasons for it. And the next community says the same thing, and so forth. And that's just a recipe for contributing to our housing shortage. So every community is going to have to find a way to be part of the solution of adding more housing to the Wasatch Front. And that doesn't necessarily mean large apartment complexes in the middle of single-family neighborhoods. It could just be things like accessory dwelling units. So that's like a basement apartment or a mother-in-law apartment, duplexes, small lots, and so forth, so that we can all be part of the solution here. And there are so many benefits to having a variety of housing types in a neighborhood. It means that the people who serve that neighborhood, the firefighters, teachers, nurses, and so forth, they can afford to live in the community that they serve. It also means that as you go through your life and move from one housing type to another, you can stay in the same neighborhood, or maybe multiple generations of a family can live in the same neighborhood. And it's also important to allow those kids from lower income households to be able to live in good neighborhoods where they have access to good schools.
Ari, how can we add more housing without making traffic and air quality worse?
Yeah, that's a great question. The key there is adding a lot of housing to places where people don't have to drive as far. So that means places where there are a lot of jobs or shopping or public transportation. And those are the great places for those large apartment complexes that I mentioned. So Think about office parks and shopping areas where maybe the retail is declining because of online shopping and so forth. You know, the I-15 corridor is where most of our jobs are, so the more we can add housing close to those jobs, the better our traffic turns out. And what we don't want to do is stop building housing in our Wasatch Front valleys where most of our jobs are. So if you push all the housing into the next valley over and everybody has to drive farther, that's not great for that family that has to drive farther for their own pocketbook and their sanity, but it's also not great for all of us because it makes traffic worse for all of us, it makes air quality worse for all of us. We have to spend more on infrastructure.
So in your opinion, what is our housing situation going to look like in 10, 20, 30 years? Will it still be affordable to buy a house then?
Well, it's really up to us. I think we get to choose that. I don't think it's ever going to go back to how it was when I got out of school, where I was able to buy a house right out of school, just because of our land constraints on the Wasatch Front. But we can make decisions that'll keep it reasonable and in check so that our kids can live on the Wasatch Front, they can live near us. It's just a matter of making sure that we provide enough housing to meet that demand as we go forward. So.
You've been hearing from Ari Bruning, President and CEO for Envision Utah. And Ari, thank you so much to your organization for joining us this whole week for conversations about growth in the state. We greatly appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having conversations about these important issues.
We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on growth in housing, or growth in Utah housing. Up next in our conversation is Dayon S. Kitch, Senior Research Fellow for the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute. Dayon, thank you so much for joining us tonight and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Give us some data about how unaffordable homes are becoming right now in Utah.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating what we've experienced, especially in the last year, has priced out about 55% of Utahns out of the medium-priced home. Prior to COVID, about 45% of Utahns were priced out of the medium-priced home. And if you're already a homeowner or if you bought a home, that's great, actually, because you're creating wealth. But if you're a renter, it's near impossible right now for you to get into home ownership. Prior to COVID, about 63% of renter households were priced out of that medium-priced home, and now that number is hovering around 75%. So it's beginning to hurt everybody. And for example, in 2015, if you were making between $35,000 to about $50,000, you could afford roughly 70% of the homes that were for sale that year. Now, with COVID and everything that's happened with that within the last year, that availability has dropped to about 30% of the market. So it's created a lot more competition, and it's really made people stuck kind of where they are.
Dayon, these numbers are staggering. So how do we compare to the rest of the country when it comes to our housing prices? Is this something that we're seeing across the country, or is this a situation sort of unique to Utah?
It's not unique to Utah. So we've seen every place in the state, in the country, has seen drastic price increases this year. What we've seen in Utah specifically, if we go back all the way to 1991, Utah has the second highest growth rate out of all 50 states. If we go back 5 years, we're also second, and even back a year, we're second. So we're stuck at that second spot. We're the second most expensive place in the country, really. So that's created a challenge for our growth, really, for our economic prosperity. Utah is a great place to live. So that's becoming more and more difficult for us to figure out going forward. Utah's always been affordable comparatively to the rest of the country. That's why it's had such great economic success. But now we're starting to really, we're kind of stuck when we look at by metropolitan area rankings. Kind of the Salt Lake Provo area is stuck between the Californias and the Washingtons and the Oregons. So we're in some scary company when we think about housing affordability.
The straightforward way to address the housing shortage is simply to just build more housing, but what are some of the nuances that can come with that?
Yeah, so when we look at building, it's the 3 L's. It's labor, land, and lumber. Okay, so we've had issues with all those for a better part of the decade, but lumber, we've seen the headlines how drastically expensive it's become in the last year. Thankfully, it's come back down. But what we really are dealing with in our market, we have a severe labor shortage in the construction industry. And that makes it harder to bring on new supply. We have, as you mentioned earlier with your other guest, we have land constraints, and the problem with land too, it's become so expensive that, for example, the price on a single family home, half of that price for that new construction is associated to just the land cost.
So going into your answer a little bit more, what else can you tell us about what's causing these rising prices?
Yeah, so part of it is really it's demographics. So with the millennial generations, we're coming into this wave of millennials where they're hitting that peak first-time home buying age, which is about 33 years of age. And we have about 35 million of those individuals in the country, or excuse me, 32.5. And that's about 9.8% of the population. In Utah, our share of that population is about 10.1. So we have this wave of demand that we just have an appetite for housing. And you have three options for housing. You either rent, you buy an existing home, or you build a new home. And all three of those components of entering into the market, they're all stressed right now. So our apartment vacancy, or our rental vacancy, is well below 5%, which would be considered a healthy market. Our days on market for existing homes for sale right now in the state, if you go to utahrealestate.com, is about seven days. And we had no seasonality in that. Typically throughout the year, the winter months, homes sit longer on the market, and in the spring and summer they pick up. We've had none of that the last 12 months because we had another aspect of the shortage we had is there weren't enough homes for sale. So typically this time of year we've had anywhere from 8,000 to 9,000 homes for sale. Right now we're hitting into the threes. So that's made it more difficult and more competitive as well.
Dayon, I think the question that many renters and aspiring home buyers want to know is, should they be waiting to buy a home because will things eventually get more affordable?
Yeah, so my family and I went through this recently. We purchased our home back in April, and it was just very difficult to find a home. And this being in my job, and I look at this every day, I've had sleepless nights thinking, should I wait, should I buy? And I feel like where we are in the demographic cycle, we have so much demand coming our way that we're going to need so much more housing that I feel like it's only going to get more expensive. The only thing right now that I feel like could really stop prices from accelerating drastically is interest rates, and they've been at historic lows. Today, as we speak, they're below 3%. So that's my number one kind of thing to look at, is where prices are going to go. So if that rate stays, below the 4% mark, I think prices will continue to keep going up.
Dayon, we've got 30 seconds left. I wonder if we can squeeze this question in real quick. What are some best practices for keeping housing affordable?
One of the most important things is keeping the affordable housing we have right now, keeping it affordable. So we see a lot of older apartments hit the market and they sell at a premium. So figuring out a way to, once that owner is ready to sell, to help keep that unit from going from $600 to $700 per month on rent, going up to $1,200 or $1,400 per month on rent.
You've been hearing from Dayon S. Kitch, Senior Research Fellow for the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute. Dayon, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation tonight. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on growth in Utah, housing. Rounding out our conversation tonight is Angela Price, Policy Director in Community and Neighborhoods Department for Salt Lake City. Angela, thanks for joining us tonight and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Rosie. Great to be here.
Angela, we were talking about this during the break. We were talking about historic buildings. Can you tell us what the city can do to incentivize historic buildings to be reused rather than demolished, and why this matters?
Yeah, that's a great question. As the folks before me stated, we are experiencing tremendous growth here in Salt Lake City and throughout the state. And Salt Lake City is a completely built out city. So we need to look at creative ways that we can repurpose our existing land and our existing buildings. And within the city, we have so many wonderful historic buildings. But unfortunately, we have some zoning barriers to the preservation of those buildings. For example, oftentimes it's challenging for a historic building to increase its density. And that increase in density is what oftentimes is needed in order to make a project economically viable. We're seeing this play out right now in our Liberty Wells neighborhood here in Salt Lake, where we had a historic mansion that was damaged by the Magna earthquake last year. The developer came to the city asking if they could potentially increase the density of that dwelling unit, and unfortunately, even though the underlying zoning allowed for that, that was not able to happen, and so that historic building is going to be demolished. And those historic buildings are really what create the character in our neighborhoods throughout the city. So we're working diligently on looking at adaptive reuse ordinances and looking at ways that we can implement policies within the city to protect those historic buildings, not only from a sustainability and an economic standpoint, but also because they really create the character in our neighborhoods here in Salt Lake City.
Right, I can see where you're coming from. Let's shift now to neighborhoods. Ari talked about this earlier in the segment. How does the city respond to neighborhoods that are opposed to change for new housing types, right? It's the not in my backyard type of thing.
Yeah, that's such an incredibly challenging situation that we face in the city. You know, we have so many wonderful neighborhoods throughout our city here, and many people have lived in those neighborhoods for a long time, even generations, and change is hard. I live in the heart of Sugar House, and I am in a 100-year-old home, but also have high rises going up in my neighborhood. And so it's hard to understand what that change is going to look like and how that's going to impact the places that we like to go, the restaurants we go, how it's going to impact our schools and our roads and our parks that we frequent in our neighborhoods. And so one of the things that we really work on in Salt Lake City is understanding what the community values are and what our quality of life values are, and holding those true when we look at planning our communities. And we really try to emphasize maintaining those values within our communities and growing in a sustainable and smart way. We know that growth is happening, and we have to, as Ari said, we can't just push it to the next city or to the next neighborhood. We have to find ways within our existing framework, within our existing neighborhoods, to grow in a sustainable way, but also not displace our existing residents, and ensuring that those community assets, those things that are the fabric of our community, stay intact.
So how is the city creatively thinking about housing solutions?
Yeah, we are really fortunate in Salt Lake City to have Mayor Mendenhall and our city council who are really visionary, and I think it's really challenging for cities who don't have leaders like we have in Salt Lake City that understand the housing crisis and are really pushing to have an equitable and livable city. And those principles, equity and livability, are really the foundation of the work that we do in Salt Lake City under Mayor Mendenhall's administration. And I'm really excited about a project that we're working on right now, which is it's called the Empowered Living Design Competition, and it's in partnership with the American Institute of Architects Utah chapter and the Community Development Corporation of Utah. And the design competition is seeking input from our design professionals to help us look at ways that we can create accessory dwelling units and tiny homes in an affordable way throughout the city. This competition it's a Salt Lake City competition, but we've actually received international press on it. So we're hoping that we get entries from all over the globe to really look at creative solutions on how we can, again, utilize our existing land within the city in a more meaningful and impactful way. And this competition, I hope, will yield some really exciting results for us. Entry is open until September 10th, and if individuals are interested in learning more about that competition, they can go to slc.gov/can, and they will find a link to the Empowered Living Design Competition. The other thing that I would say is we hear this often from the governor and the legislature. Here in Utah, one of the great things we have is our special sauce. or so we call it, which is our partnerships and our collaboration. And I've seen over the past year and a half through the pandemic, groups of people coming together that never would have gotten around the table. And a great example is our partners with Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute, Envision Utah, Salt Lake County, the state of Utah. We all are coming together, understanding, using the data that our partners are providing us, hearing what our residents are saying, and coming together to find creative policy solutions to get people in housing and keep people in their housing and off of the streets. And so I think that we have some really great opportunities here in the state with federal funding coming in and just the amazing collaboration that we have within Utah. It's really remarkable.
I really love hearing about all the engagement from all these different groups and individuals, because it really is a tall task. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but you've been hearing from Angela Price, Policy Director in Community and Neighborhoods Department for Salt Lake City. Angela, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Rosie.